So you are all very welcome at the second session of First Wednesday Spring series called Conflict and Migration Through Lens of Solidarity that we run through spring months up to June. So we are very happy to have you here on this second session of 3 sessions. The next one will be on the 1st of June, and we will be looking at criminalization of humanitarians. So we hope that you will be able to join us too. And each session is running at 7 p.m. of the first Wednesday of each month. And this session is organized in a partnership with the University of Maynooth. And we have Patrick Maran here with us, who will be moderating this session, Sally Hayden and Shamim Malekmian. Both who are journalists, and unfortunately, I'm not sure if Najib is here with us, hiding under a different name, but he might be joining us later if he's not here yet. So my apologies for that. And if Najib is here, we will be asking him questions as well and talking to him this evening. This First Wednesdays, for those of you who don't know, this series of events has been run by Kolof for over 10 years now. And so it's a part of a bigger kind of series of conversations on current topics that are interesting to our audiences. And without further ado, I will pass the voice now to Patrick, who will be moderating the session and will introduce you to our speakers and tonight's session. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Aga. It's my pleasure to be here. As Aga said, my name is Patrick Maran, and I'm from the Department of International Development down at Maynooth University. I specialize in economics and politics. Just a little plug for our department down there. We do an undergraduate program in international development, and we have 2 MAs on offer, one in international development and another on peace building, security and development practice. And I'm also, very importantly, a fully paid up CoLab member. So I just thought I'd put that out there. So just by way of context, I suppose it gives me a chance. I'm going to be in the background for most of this, but session 2 on this first Wednesday is titled Solidarity in Crisis. I suppose, like many others, I've been amazed by the open arms approach of EU member states to those Ukrainians fleeing from the Russian attack. And I suppose, in particular, the speed at which policies have changed, borders have been opened, offers of accommodation, and even access to labour markets. And all of it is very commendable and very, very positive. But it really puts in stark contrast the very unyielding EU border policies that block and impede the efforts of many others who equally are fleeing war, humanitarian disasters, human rights abuses, and are seeking refuge here and safety in Europe. And it's these same policies, unyielding policies, that have resulted in the loss of many, many lives for those who are on the wrong side of the European wall. And, I'm thinking about those who are fleeing from the Taliban, Afghanistan, those who are trapped on the Belarusian-Polish border, and in particular, I suppose, those who have, take that very dangerous journey across the Mediterranean from North Africa and the Middle East. And one of our panelists here, Sally Hayden, posed a question or questions. She said, why do we still have so little empathy and understanding? And why do we continue to inflict horrors on people who are simply trying to reach safety? And we don't really have the excuse of saying, well, I don't know, or I wasn't aware of how bad things were. All of these trials are documented now and covered by media, and they're brought into our living rooms, onto our laptops, our smartphones, along with the framing of those particular events, sometimes stirring empathy and pathos. And I'm thinking now of the tragedy of Alan Shenankurdi, a 2-year-old boy who drowned in the Mediterranean on the 2nd of September in 2015, along with his mother and brother, trying to escape the civil war that was taking place in Syria at that particular time. And the photo of Alan lying there face down on the beach by the Turkish photographer Nilüfer Demir captured, I suppose, our attention, and we focused very much on the inhumanity of the system that caused that tragic death. And that still photograph, and resulting media coverage began to drive a debate on how to improve, the asylum system here in Europe, but only for a while. And then the media moved on, and I suppose we moved on as well with it. Now, that's not to say that the media was always sympathetic, and this is something that we look at here. You know, there is often kind of another flip side, which is kind of a very vicious and cold narrative that's spread by those who are hostile to asylum and offers of refuge. So a central theme of these first Wednesdays is how can we best promote solidarity with and understanding of those who leave their homes and take unimaginable risks with themselves and with their loved ones to find safety and establish new lives. So in this session, we'll focus on the role of the media in promoting an understanding of the plight and the issues around refugee migration, and its role played in shaping narratives of empathy, of compassion, or in some cases, hostility and anger. Gary Young, the former Guardian Washington correspondent and now professor of sociology in Manchester University, writes on this very topic actually in this month's Prospect magazine in an article entitled "They Look Like Us." Young, while recognizing the incredible response of European governments and citizens to Ukrainian war refugees, writes, "Ukrainians are no better or worse than Syrians, Yemenis, Eritreans, or Iraqis at telling people's stories or making them laugh. Yet," he said, "the West has fallen in love with them as refugees in a way it has proved incapable of doing with those from Africa or the Arab world. And the inhumanity and hypocrisy of this is self-evident." So Young asks, does the response, though, shown to the Ukrainian conflict offer an opportunity for a shift in how we discuss our responsibilities towards refugees, asylum seekers, and displaced people? An opportunity to, as he says, recalibrate what meeting our global responsibilities might look like, if only we could expand our understanding of who qualifies as human. So that is the topic for tonight's first Wednesday's talks, and we have a fantastic panel of journalists to discuss how media can shape narratives around issues of asylum and seeking refuge. So I'd like to introduce our two speakers that we have today. So we've got Shamim Malik Niam, who's a journalist with the Dublin Inquirer, where she covers issues of immigration, and her reports offer, many different nuanced angles around the process and from the perspectives of those often experiencing the system personally. She's written in Hot Press, the Irish Examiner. She also writes in climate change issues. And she was named in 2019 by Media HQ as one of the top female journalists to watch out for. And then we have Sally Hayden, who you may have read her reports from Somalia and Kenya and Uganda in the Irish Times, where she works as the Africa correspondent. And she's a multi-award-winning Irish journalist and the author of a new book, My Fourth Time We Drowned, Seeking Refuge in the World's Deadliest Migration Route. So Shamim and Sally, it's a pleasure to be here and have an opportunity to speak to you. And we'll kick off with the opening question. Could you tell us a little bit about how you got into journalism and when did tonight's topic become a focus for you? Whoever wants to kick it.
You want to go first, Sally? I go first. Okay. Well, thank you so much, Patrick. Well, I suppose you could say why I got into journalism. I come from a background where I suppose I saw firsthand the impact of suppression of speech, suppression of press, and how it can impact people's lives and contribute to keeping dictatorships in place and just keeping people oppressed. So that always kind of had me interested in newspapers, and I always would read newspapers even when I was very young. So I really enjoyed, I liked the aspect of how it impacted and how when it's suppressed, when I firsthand saw how it impacts. So that made me interested in it. When I moved to Ireland, I studied journalism and I just started writing for papers and became a journalist basically. Was to answer the second part of the question, which was how I became interested in immigration reporting. Well, I didn't want to touch it, which is a weird thing to say because I thought, oh, it's too close to home for me, maybe it's not right, whereas now I look at it completely differently. So I was writing about mostly climate change issues, which was something I really was interested in. And I did that for about 4 years. And when I was writing on very kind of unfair kind of conditions, I wasn't paid properly. It was really awful, the condition I was in. And then I got out of that situation after 4 years, and it was coincided with the pandemic. So what I was doing at the time was I started covering COVID-19 outbreaks in direct provision centers. And that kind of got people's attentions. And I think that was successful for Hot Press magazine. And so I did that a little bit. And then Dublin Inquirer put out a call. They wanted somebody to cover immigration. And this was something that they did a survey from their readers, and they were asking people, what is it that we're not covering that you want to see being covered? And people had chosen immigration. So, and they had kind of included that they wanted somebody who had first-hand experiences with the immigration system. So I thought, well, I do, so I should do it, and I got it, and I've been doing it for about 2 years now, and I really like doing it, and I like to look at the nuances of especially refugee immigration laws and how the system works. So I guess that's about it.
Very good, thanks for that. And Sally?
Yeah, sure, and thank you for having me. So in terms of why I became a journalist, I mean sorry, something came up on my screen. My background was in law. I did an undergraduate degree in law, and then a master's in international politics, which I think both are kind of about learning how the world works, basically. That's what I've always been interested in. And when I finished my master's, I got a fellowship, a journalism fellowship, to go to Malawi to report there. And basically that was my first time doing international reporting. But at the time that I was there, very briefly, there was a big corruption scandal that broke. And I essentially, because it's such a poor country, there's very limited local media in terms of what they actually are able to cover and the resources they have. And I basically saw firsthand the detrimental impacts of not having access to facts, not having accurate information, and not having a press that was capable of telling the public what was going on in terms of the people that are controlling them. And as a result of that, I mean, that was when I started doing international reporting. Then I had a staff job for 2 years in Vice News in London. And that was including the year of the so-called European migration crisis, 2015, when I went over to Calais to report on people who were trying to reach the UK. And basically, when I was there, I just met so many people from countries across the world. And I was handing out business cards saying, stay in touch, let me know what we should be covering. Obviously, it was the time that David Cameron had said there are swarms of migrants coming to the UK. And obviously that wasn't really telling the story of who was there and why they were trying to reach the UK and what was going on. So that basically started my interest in doing longer term projects, or more in-depth projects looking at migration issues. And I've tended to focus my reporting on looking at areas that, I'll receive tip-offs and then spend a lot of time looking into something, but focusing on stories that challenge people's understanding or preconceptions of, migration and refugee issues. So for example, I did an investigation on what happens to Syrian refugees who do try to return to Syria. And I did another on allegations of corruption within the UN Refugee Agency. And like you said in your introduction, the latest thing I've been working on is the book, which is now in shops if anyone wants to buy it, My Fourth Time We Drowned. This was the culmination of, depending on when you start counting, from between, I'd say, 3 and 7 years of reporting. And it focuses on what is happening to refugees on the central Mediterranean route. So coming from Libya to either Italy or Malta, that basically have run foul of hardening European migration policy, so are being forced back to Libya into indefinite detention, and basically all the consequences of that hardening policy. And yeah, I think that answers the question.
Very good, excellent. It's interesting, I was struck actually by two things. One, that both of you, there seems to be, in terms of the participation and getting people to, the readers to feed into what you want to focus on, but kind of very different, very interesting perspectives and complementary perspectives on the process. Like if I was to say to you, like, why should I be interested in this? Why is media coverage of this issue important? What would your response be to that?
I just want to say that whatever I say is on the scale of my own reporting in Ireland, because I never had the opportunity or privilege to do any outside Ireland reporting. So it's very limited to the Irish concept, whatever I say. For example, I think for me, it's important to cover the things the way I cover them, because I think for a long time, the media in Ireland, when it comes to immigration, it has often taken two routes of either doing very patronizing coverage of it in terms of very congratulatory pieces, or people are fitting in here, we're welcoming them, it's really nice, or it's very well intentioned, and I understand that the intentions are very good. But it comes across as, I think people who read it, the wider kind of society kind of sees that, oh, they congratulate themselves when they see it, of letting in all the immigrants in and treating them well, and look how well they're fitting in the society. So because of this, there was loads of issues that were kind of hidden from the public. And like when I first joined Dublin Inquirer, there were things that I was personally nobody had covered before. So they were there, you know, I immediately could cover like 3 topics off the top of my head that I could cover that nobody had written about. And I think sometimes these well-intentioned coverage of things does hide stories that are important. And I think the wider issue is that because a lot of reporters who do report on migration do not have migration backgrounds, so the stories, they're very much dependent on whether or not somebody gets onto them to say, to give them a tip about something, you know. And then also there is the editor might not relate to that situation, for example. So for me, it's important, and it's important to highlight this. And why is it important for the public? Because the public got to know that, you know, yeah, these are just congratulatory pieces. There's this nice coverage of people feeling in, but there are other large group of people who are also being wronged by the immigration system, who have to navigate unnecessary bureaucratic system of migration and just go through. And sometimes I feel it and I see it as people being punished or being discouraged actively by the bureaucratic system to just give up on their migration journey and go back to their countries, you know. So I think that's, for me, the main thing is just not to let the stories that are important and problems to be hidden from the public view, you know.
Very good. Okay, excellent. Thank you.
And
Sally?
yeah, for me to answer, I mean, why should you care about it? In terms of my reporting, I would say that there are horrific human rights abuses being perpetrated in your name, and that you are complicit in these happening, that your money, your tax money is being spent, like billions of euro are being spent to try and stop Africans, for example, from trying to cross into Europe. And the consequences of that are not necessarily what you would think. Like it's resulting in propping up militias and propping up dictatorships and in securitization of borders in a way that's actually leading to a lot more oppression. And so, I mean, as a journalist, this is a really frustrating thing, because in one sense, I don't think that it's I think our position is to report, you know. It's not our position to try and convince you to care. Actually, like, you should care anyway, you know. I shouldn't have to beg you to pay attention. But the reason that these things are happening is because people aren't, there isn't an outcry, you know, because there aren't, European publics want to remain comfortable, basically, and they aren't engaging with this information. And I do think, I mean, I know this is a discussion about the media, but I think that the public generally bears a lot of responsibility, because a lot of this information is available, but it's not being looked at. And for us, that can be very frustrating, that you can be reporting and reporting and reporting something and people just aren't reading it or aren't paying attention. So yeah, I mean, and it becomes a bit of a self-perpetuating loop, you know, if we're writing stories that aren't getting viewers or aren't getting support or aren't getting shared or aren't getting attention, then of course, like Shamim said as well, that could lead an editor maybe not to commission a story on a similar topic in the future, and that can lead to worse coverage. And so I think that the public, you know, bears a lot of responsibility when it comes to helping journalists in this regard by actually paying attention to the work, because it is there, you know, you can't say that it's not being covered.
Yeah, just explain, like, for somebody who who's never stepped into kind of a mainstream newspaper, but you know, the role of editorial direction in terms of shaping where you go with your stories. You just mentioned, for instance, if there's not enough uptake, then it could, the editor may look unfavorably then when you propose a similar story in the future. Like, how much shape do editors have in terms of what you do and what you report, and I suppose the tone of what you report as well?
I mean, if you want me, sorry, just to answer that as a follow-on, I'm quite lucky in that I'm freelance, so I can choose what I focus on. And then I'm also quite lucky in the editors that I work with, that they tend to appreciate that if I think something is important, then it generally, you know, is like, they tend to give me the space. I don't get told, you know, you need to shape it like this or you need to shape it like this. I get to report based on my, you know, on what facts I gather, on what reporting I do and the evidence that I get. But of course, it probably depends on the newspaper. You know, certain newspapers, I think particularly in the UK, have certain political stance, but I've never personally been censored except once, which is actually mentioned in my book, where I did a report for a UAE based newspaper, which then got censored. But I avoid working for places that will censor reporting in that sense. Sorry, Shamim.
Yeah, I suppose it's really very much depends on the newspaper, as Sally said, and what is their understanding or approach to immigration coverage. Because at the end of the day, they have to commission, as Sally said, the story, and they have to give the go-ahead to a story to go ahead. You know, it's just not, if I have an idea, I might think the idea is great, but my editor might not think the same. But as like Sally, I'm very fortunate to work with editors who are pretty much on the same page as I am when it comes to migration coverage. And we have a process with my editors where every story idea that I give them, I tell them why it matters, you know, and if my argument for why it matters is convincing enough, they usually go for it. But it's very issue focused. So if the issue is important enough, I've never been told no, not to cover it, you know. But I know for a fact that for sure with some papers, like if something is not getting public attention or clicks or whatever, it might not get picked up or followed on because they see it as not important. It's just very much depends on the attitudes of the paper, you know. But in broadly speaking, in my own experience, I think I've had it very good with the editing. I suppose. I've pretty much, I'm very much happy with the editing process that I have at the moment. Dublin Inquirer is known for very rigorous editing, but I enjoy doing it because I love journalism, you know.
In terms of kind of trying to get a story, like how open are policymakers or officials to journalists, you know, looking for information in your experience, either on the Irish, for instance, in terms of the Irish immigration system, or Sally, in the work that you've done?
In terms of the government officials, when you go to them with queries?
Yeah.
I've been working with the Justice Department for a very long time now, so I'm very, very well known to them. So they're usually very responsive to me, and they do their best, I suppose, to reply to my queries. But what I get, sometimes it gets frustrating because what you get is just a repetition, a repetition of a line you might have read in a response to a parliamentary question before. When you read some of the responses, you're like, I think I've seen that before, so you don't really get much nuances. But especially the Justice Department, I've seen they've given me stats a lot of times, the stats that I thought I might have not been able to get from the without freedom of information. But overall, they have been good. And with freedom of information, I think the International Protection Office, I've been able to get some good information out of putting in FOIA requests to them. So I think they are responsive enough to queries, but it's just the fact that it's not always what you're hoping to get, or it's a clear-cut answer for a source who's having a problem, unless it's just very specific. And I think one thing I like to bring up here is that the line that I can't comment on a specific case, or you can argue GDPR, but if this person has already speaking out about their case to a journalist is being named publicly, I think it's fair enough that the Justice Department or other government departments can comment publicly about their case. They can actually.
Yeah, but you find them fairly open to engaging with your journalist questions, which is positive.
I mean, they meet the deadlines and they do send on the responses. It's just, they're okay about that. Yeah, it's just that I get frustrated when I don't get, when I describe to them a very, very specific case, give them all the details, and they still come back with the line of, we can't comment on specific immigration cases. Because some cases are so unique, you really need a comment on why this happened to this person,
Okay, very good. And Sally, how do you find the officials, say in Uganda or Kenya, or the UN?
Yeah, I mean, officials, so particularly for the book, I mainly was dealing with UN or NGO aid officials, or EU, the EU in various aspects of it. And I tend to find that the best information comes from people speaking anonymously. It doesn't come from going through press offices, spokespeople. I mean, it never comes from them pretty much. Like sometimes you can get a bit of this or a bit of that, but it tends to be, vague statements basically that don't necessarily actually answer your questions, particularly in the topics that I reported for my book. But I would have a lot of sources among UN agencies and also even in the EU who tell me things, anonymously. And then you can approach the spokespeople and try and get a response to that. But I mean, I always think the difference between what is said by those in power and what is experienced by those who are the most vulnerable it can be extremely different. And I see my job as being, of course, you triangulate information, you do verification, you fact check everything. But I see my job as being elevating the experiences of the most vulnerable, particularly when it comes to human rights abuses and things that they're experiencing that aren't being appreciated or that aren't being understood, and then posing those to officials. And I think that a lot of statements can be kind of workarounds, so it can make it seem like something is being done when actually, if you have that knowledge of what is happening on the ground, that it's not like what is being suggested is not necessarily an answer, or it's not necessarily a functional system. For example, it might just be something that is being proposed, but it's not actually, reaching the vast majority of people. But it's very important because unfortunately, like a lot of journalists do desk reporting and they don't have a specialization in this area. And if you don't have a specialization, you don't have the knowledge to know when a statement is not telling the full truth or maybe, inaccurate even, then you can present that as fact, and that can be quite damaging. And I've seen that done many, many times, and it's something that I wasn't even fully aware of until I started reporting in depth on this area. So yeah, I think as a journalist, it's very important not just to go with whatever the official line is. You really need to speak to people who have actually experienced something and get their opinion on what's being said.
That seems like is that deliberate misinformation or just spinning a line to get rid of the journalist?
I mean, I couldn't say that it's deliberate misinformation because I think that would be conjecture on my part, but I can say that sorry to keep promoting my book, but please, I really hope people read it because that's why I wrote it. And you can see in the book I lay that out when there are statements that were made that are not accurate in terms of what was happening. I mean, people can make their own deductions as to why those statements were made, but it can be seen quite clearly when that is happening. And a lot of that is being done. I mean, this is what UN officials, for example, will tell me. This is what many people working on the ground say, that this is being done to whitewash the effects of European migration policy, which is incredibly damaging. And I mean, this isn't fully an answer to your question, but everybody should be aware that the head of the EU border agency has just stepped down, and that's been because of investigative journalism related to human rights abuses on Europe's borders. And this is actually like a very, very critical time in terms of what Europe has been doing. And yeah, I think everybody should be paying attention to that fact at the moment, because this is actually a time when we don't know what direction the future is going to go in. Is it going to become more human rights focused? And yeah, it's only going to be that if the European public is conscious of this. And I actually was in an event yesterday with an advisor to the EU Commission, a former advisor, and he was saying basically, this is slightly unrelated, but he was saying that basically everything is being done to get politicians re-elected. And what polls is that most European publics don't want African refugees or African migrants. They just don't feel as sympathetic towards them, for example, as when it's Ukrainians, when it's white migrants or white refugees, when it's people coming, you know, through more privileged routes. And he was saying, well, they need to get re-elected. And so if the European public aren't calling out against these human rights abuses, then you know, nothing's going to happen, because the politicians, in the end of the day, they want to be re-elected more than anything else. So yeah, I don't know if that answers, but
yeah, I was going to ask about that. Like, so I asked you about the officials, but like, you know, in terms of who makes policy, I suppose politicians, when things are put on an agenda by the media, and they can become responsive to that. Now, that can be driven by, you know, media attention just being paid to something, but also media paying attention to something because it's something the public are interested in. And like are politicians sympathetic, Shamim, in terms of the Irish immigration policy, like for instance, direct provision whenever or was that something that they said, well, you know, this is the way the system is, or did you have people, vanguards, that wanted to say, no, it's a poor system and it needs to be reformed?
Even you, in terms of TDs and politicians?
Yeah, TDs, yeah.
Yeah, I think it differs from party to party, you know. But for the most part, most of them, especially the opposition parties, obviously would be more sympathetic towards towards migration and refugees. But what I do is I mostly kind of avoid talking to politicians a lot. You know, that's not something I do. I kind of prefer to kind of engage with sources and people, because it's a weird one. Like if you can't just focus on one politician, you have to involve all of them, you know, if you're doing a story. So I kind of sort of a little bit avoid that. But in terms of, it's interesting what you asked actually now ties in a little bit to why it's important for the public to engage with these stories, because I don't know if you remember, but the Justice Department had this little social media watch list or whatever it was, where they were watching people and they were writing reports about how much people engaged with a journalist's story. You know, like they had written 15 people, you know, liked my story or retweeted my story, and they kind of made a record of that. I think I'm hoping, or I thought maybe that meant to think, if this story is getting so much public attention, maybe this is an area we should kind of focus on and bring in some improvements and policy change. When it didn't get much attention, I thought maybe they say, oh, it's not our priority. It's not something that would impact our public image. So I think it's very important for people to engage with these stories, to share them, because if the Justice Department is so concerned with how much engagement adversarial reporting gets on social media, it's got to have some sort of impact on policy,
And do you, like both of you, do you find how responsive do you find the public are? Like when you talk about, I cover this, like just as like, or do people kind of glaze over, or do they say, God, that's really interesting, just as kind of a vox pop?
For me, I suppose it's very difficult because people who follow you, for the most part, they're there to look at your stories, so they engage with it pretty much. They would engage with it positively, but like I had a piece about climate change refugees, and then one morning I get up and it's like I have loads of notifications. They're all like far right people tagging me about it, so you get negative notifications on that as well, and it's disheartening for sure. But unfortunately, because of how Twitter works, because of the algorithm, and because you're so I suppose siloed into your own bubble of social media, that I don't think it reaches that level. And for example, Dublin Inquirer, we don't have paid ads or things like that, what other mainstream papers do. So we wouldn't be able to reach as much as we have the potential to reach, sometimes.
Okay, Sally?
In terms of the public, I mean, I think sometimes it just feels honestly like shouting into a black hole. Like that's what reporting on this area can be like. And I do think that, like, for me, what I try and focus on if I'm doing a longer term report, like I said, I try and uncover new information that will, change your understanding of something, or that corrects like a misportrayal of how a system is working, for example, or how something is being done. And I do that because I think that the public is generally very skeptical about, people have whatever their view is, like, and there's been so much political kind of debate over things like immigration, and it's used as a political football, like it's really, people like migrants, refugees are blamed for things that they're absolutely like not even involved in. And that means that people have kind of, if you write a story, for example, about someone who's suffered something terrible, I think that there's a certain amount of the public that will just switch off because they'll say, oh, I think you chose that story on purpose because you think it's going to tug at my heartstrings. And I think that there are others who will share that and amplify it, but also they're probably the ones who already were feeling very sympathetic towards refugee issues anyway. And so for my reporting, I try not to focus just on personal story. I'm actually looking at the structures that are in place and the damage that they're causing people, and our policy and the damage that our policy is causing, and looking at that in a more macro sense, and then challenging what we think that we understand about that. So in that sense anyway, I don't know again that it has that much impact, but I do think that type of story, people respect it if you put in a lot of context and you say, actually, when you hear about the UN Refugee Agency, this is the perspective of refugees on that, or when you hear about refugee resettlement, this is what that means. I think people actually respect that more because they see like that you're trying to tell them, and we're kind of not nuanced is the wrong word, but you're trying to actually explain it to them and why it might be wrong in terms of the types of sound bites that politicians give you, like why they actually sometimes don't necessarily make sense or reflect the realities. I did notice that one big impact that my reporting had was when I started posting a Twitter thread of messages. So for people who don't know, my reporting has focused on the central Mediterranean route particularly. And basically the EU has been supporting the Libyan Coast Guard to effectively circumnavigate international law because European vessels can't return refugees to a country where their life is in danger, but Libyan vessels can. And so since 2017, more than 90,000 men, women, and children have been intercepted trying to reach Europe and forced back to Libya, and many of them locked up indefinitely in detention centers that have been compared to concentration camps. So this is what I've been looking at now for 4 years. And one thing that did actually create a big response in terms of public attention was when I started posting WhatsApp messages, like screenshots of WhatsApp messages from detained refugees in Libya describing what they were going through. And I started a Twitter thread with that, and it got millions of views, like literally millions, which is pretty crazy. But I think that was because if you show something like a WhatsApp message, suddenly people can picture, actually, this is, this could be sent to me. This is something, this is in a format that I'm aware of. This is, actually a person calling for help, and they, they connect that in their mind. But I mean, it's sad that we have to do that. It's sad that we have to say, this is also a person, and here's a way of making you realize that. And yeah, I don't know. I think there's, I don't know, ways to go in terms of that, but it was interesting for me, the response that particular thread got.
And it seems to be kind of, you, like both of you talked about the public, and it's important that the public engage, which I agree completely, but to how to get them to engage, to kind of see that that could be them in other circumstances, and see the kind of the shared humanity, that the challenge around that. That seems to be central to making that sort of connection. And how do you do that, or how do you try to do that? Like, say you've given a good example there, where like you can receive a WhatsApp message, so you could really, you can relate to that. Shamim, how do you try and create that connection for people when you're reporting on immigration, kind of the immigrant experience here in the refugee system in Ireland?
Yeah, as I said before, like, I think it's very difficult. I think it's very difficult to create that, because you're essentially reporting on non-white issues to a very white society, and who likes to see themselves in a very positive way, who likes to think we're doing good, for all the refugees that are coming here. So it's really difficult to get them to see it. And I think the media coverage doesn't help. Like, for example, I was still kind of shocked that in the Dublin Inquirer, and I was the first person, at least, to kind of write about how non-EU people still can't come, even if they're fleeing Ukraine war, still can't come to Ireland, because we opened our doors to kind of Ukrainian refugees. And I'm just kind of shocked by this. But I think Sally also mentioned this, but the way to go is that to kind of explain the unfairness of the system to them, instead of just focus on one person, and just say, oh, this is a whole of horrible stuff happening to this person. You don't need to kind of be wishy-washy about it. I think if you explain the system to them and make them think about how unfair the system is, because I don't think it's easy to get the public who don't have these experiences to relate to the experiences. But it's easy to get them to relate to unfairness of a system that's not working, that is a broken system. A broken system is something that all of us can relate to, So yeah, if you could look at the system and how it's not working, and explain it in plain language to the public and how it's failing people, then they say, oh yeah, if this was me, if I encountered a bureaucratic system like this, I would have been frustrated too, So I think that's the best way to get people to relate to some situations like this.
Okay. So, like, is there kind of a stock response, do you think, that kind of creates, like, do people more engage with the more, they say, oh, well, people in the system here, they're only, they're economic refugees, or in the case of those trying to come across in the Mediterranean. Is that still out there, do you think, or is that just how people shield themselves from the issues?
Yeah.
Is that something you've come across, like,
I've definitely encountered it, and especially this was my latest one on climate change refugees, where it kind of peaked with people were like, oh, they're just economic migrants. There's no such thing as climate change refugees, and this is where, and the concept of climate change is still something that some people don't believe in, and then if you don't relate to migration anyway, then it's really hard. It's a hard sell, so I definitely get that still, and unfortunately this is still out there. Yeah, definitely.
Sally?
I think for me as well, I mean, that's one big question that I have in terms of the jargon that we're using or the language that we're using. I think that constantly needs to be challenged, because that is being promoted or being used by, I know that there are legal terms, but it's also being used again by politicians or by people in power who are trying to categorize things in a certain way that actually might not be fairly representative of the situation. And I actually lived in Sierra Leone in West Africa for a lot of the last year. It's one of the poorest countries in the world, and it really challenged my understanding of what an economic migrant is, because people who come from Sierra Leone, they did have a war in the past, but at this point they generally wouldn't be regarded as refugees. They'd be regarded as economic migrants. But what I learned pretty quickly living there is that in Sierra Leone, the life expectancy is, I think, 26 years less than it is in Europe. For example, I was there during the COVID wave. There were no ventilators. So if you got COVID and needed a ventilator, you died. It's one of the most dangerous places in the world to give birth. It's very dangerous for children. 1 in 10 children die before their 5th birthday from generally preventable illnesses. And so if you look at that, that's a result of poverty, but it's also a threat to life, isn't it? It's a very, very real threat to life that exists there all of the time. And so those people would be classed as an economic migrant, but actually, to flee to try and reach a place where you can live 26 more years, or you won't die from a preventable illness, or your child might live past their 5th birthday. Is that really like being an economic migrant in the sense that we would understand? That challenged me. I think one other thing that I was just thinking earlier when you were saying, I know you're talking a lot about the media and the perception that the media gives, and this is just an unfinished thought, so please take it as you will, but I actually have just been spending a bit more time in Dublin than I have in about a decade. And the other day there was a TV on, and I saw an ad for, I actually don't know which charity it was, but it was one charity that was raising money for, and they didn't specify a country, so they just showed pictures of Black people, I assume Africans, I think it was children and a mother. They never said which country they are in, and they said something like, people are hungry, you need to give us money so that we can feed basically like these Black people. And it was, for me, that was quite shocking, because I mean, I work as an Africa correspondent. We try and contextualize. So I was recently in Somalia, where people are actually hungry. There is a serious food crisis, but that is like one small part of Africa. That's not all Africans who are experiencing that. And I think the Irish public is being constantly, or from what I can see anyway, or, I was asking people about this afterwards, and they were saying actually this type of charity messaging is quite common. And for me, I'm wondering, what does it do to the Irish public that they can see these types of images? And then for me, I'm writing, for example, about an African refugee from a specific country who's fleeing a specific situation, but in fact, maybe they're thinking the entire continent is just full of people who are, desperate and can't be saved, basically. And what kind of impact is that having in terms of the sympathy that they have for specific situations, or the understanding that they have about the context that is existing? And a lot of the of what I write about is how European migration policy is actually oppressing people across Africa. And that's something that's happening because we don't have enough scrutiny of the policies, of European policies across Africa and of European spending. And it makes me kind of understand, if there's this total lack of nuance that you can show a picture of people and not even say what country they're in, then maybe, the public has kind of been primed to not be asking these questions. So, I mean, I say that as an unfinished thought. I just think it's another thing that people need to be asking themselves. So yeah, sorry.
Yeah, I suppose I could answer to some of that, that there's been a lot of work around that negative images and messages, like the likes of Koloff, for instance. There is actually a policy, a kind of a set of standards to move away from that type of negative imaging. And it has a huge impact, massive impact. Like I see it with the first years that we come in, you know, in terms of their preconceptions around people coming outside of Europe, you know, in terms of being very dependent. And yeah, it's a really, yeah, like, so for every kind of one positive message that's out there, unfortunately, there's kind of people are swept back out again then by some of this negative messaging.
But sorry, and I would say the issue is not negative messaging. The issue is a lack of context. So like there are negative situations, you know, you can say that things are bad in certain situations, but if you don't say which African country it's happening in, for example, then you just give the perspective that this is an African problem, that this is every country in Africa, that this is happening to all Africans. And for me, again, it's not, because I hear this debate from like AIDS, you know, people who work in AIDS, should we do positive or negative imagery? I would say actually you just need to have context so that people can actually see this. These situations are more complicated than just, you know, thinking that I don't know. I just think, yeah, it's context. The context is what is missing. And when you're trying to raise donations, maybe it's helpful to leave out context, but actually we've seen in a lot of situations that not explaining the political context, for example, like we saw even in the Ethiopia famine, which many people know in 1984, that was a politically created famine, but then that wasn't, you know, that wasn't shown when you show the images of starving people. You don't explain that context, then actually maybe you can do more harm than good. So I just think the context is what's necessary. It's not negative or positive.
Yeah, agree completely. Yeah. Shamim, do you want to come in on that, or?
No, I just completely agree with Sally.
I've got a practical question on that. Like you talked about context, and we live in a world where people's attention span seems to be getting shorter and shorter and shorter. You know, that acronym, too long didn't read, TLDR. Like, how do you deal with that as an issue? Like, how do you get context, deliver context, when you're working with an audience that seems to be, you know, anything over 50 to 60 words is a long read. Like, how do you deal with that from a practical perspective?
Look, we have a policy, I know, like I can't go to 2,000 words, you know, just because for this reason, because we want the reader to read the story. We don't want them to kind of, as you said, TLDR or whatever, or just not be interested in or engage in. So I usually, what I would file, the longest I would file would be a 1,500 words article, you know. It was not like that in the past, but this is what I do with Dublin Inquirer, because we're so keen to get people to read the story, you know. What happens is it's really difficult, and a lot of times I struggle with things that I have to leave out, you know, and it just keeps you in this state of dilemma. What is the most important piece of information that I have to communicate in the limited amount of word count that I have? So yeah, it is very difficult, but it is important. I think it is important. I think we should leave out some information that are not maybe key out, because we need to get the key message across, and we want the audience to read the story, not to just read the headline or not just the first line, you know. It's really important to get people to engage with the story, I think.
In terms of me, I mean, I don't know that I'm the right person to answer, because my book is like 460 pages long, I'm pretty certain. But, I know it's quite long, but I would say that basically I think that our number one job is to like gather the information and to make sure that it's available. I think this information is very hard won. I mean, as Shamim knows as well, like it can be very difficult making sure that making this available, like it can actually be very hidden. You know, people think, oh, I've read that bad things are happening to refugees, but like when you get into more of the specifics, like they might not actually be publicly available at all, and so they're not being considered, for example, by policymakers or by politicians or by aid officials or anybody. I think that I even wrote about this in the book, that I had some problems initially getting it published, because I was working with an agent who said, you know, this doesn't have a killer narrative, that that we need to make sure that, you know, he wanted me to basically fictionalize elements of it. And he was like, a public, they need a composite character. So we have one refugee that basically experiences all of the things that a refugee can experience. And then because what I'm documenting is these detention centers, like, so life inside these detention centers that Pope Francis, among others, has compared to concentration camps, and what is happening to refugees locked up indefinitely in them as a result of European policy. And I was told, you know, we can't name specific, we can't have multiple detention centers. We need to have one, and we need to call it the detention center, because a public otherwise will have problems, you know, following this. And for me, I couldn't do that. I mean, I broke up with that agent. Like I said, what's the point in writing a book if, you know, I want this as a documentation of what is happening. I want to make sure that there is, that this, you know, that this evidence exists, and that people can, that we can name the places. For example, I mean, many people die in these detention centers. I want to name the places where they died, so that there can be more awareness or more evidence of what is, you know, of these crimes, basically. But I think that that is something that you're being asked to, that you can't sacrifice, basically. You just have to make sure, I mean, you can try and make it as readable as possible. And I include a lot of personal stories in the book, you know, love stories, stories that, you know, might surprise people, details about just general life, you know, even some funny moments in terms of what people experienced and what they told me. But at the same stage, pandering to an audience means that you might be leaving out some information that could actually be quite useful. And I've seen that, like, with my reports used as evidence in you know, legal challenges, for example. And it might not even be the specific piece of information that you thought was going to be important, but it might be something that suddenly, you know, might be very key to a challenge that might change asylum law or asylum rights in a particular location. And so I think it's important that we have that information. And I also think that you need to give a bit of credit to the general public, like that they actually, I mean, they should be interested, but also that many people do have the desire to know this information. And if we're constantly kind of pandering down and taking out details so that, you know, and erasing again the context or the nuance or the complicated factors or more information about the systems, then I think that the general public actually, they do end up with this doubt because they feel like you're using them, like you might have a political edge or something like that. And actually, sometimes it's good to have context, but at the same stage, I totally empathize with Shamim. I mean, I don't think everything can be 460 pages, you know, and you do need it digestible where possible. But yeah, but I don't think that means that we shouldn't do longer or more detailed reports.
No. It's just what we do at Dublin Inquirer. Yeah. I'm saying no one should write a book or a long form piece, you know.
No, I know, and yeah, your work is great, and that's for me with the newspaper as well. It will tend to be a lot shorter, but yeah, I guess I just would think that, yeah, we need to be, I don't know. I just think you can get too caught up in, of course, like if you have a word count or whatever, that's fine. But more in relation to the broader question, I think that as journalists, which Shamim also knows, like you can't pander too much to an audience so much that you are actually like erasing some of the valuable information or like diminishing your reporting. You have to do the best you can to make sure that everything is conveyed.
Yeah. I was talking to somebody the other day and they said, you know, how long would a blog post have to be for you to engage with? And they said, well, anything over like 100 words, I switch off with. So it's a bit alarming for both of you in terms of your own deadlines. Now, I've got a couple of questions here from the moderator, talking about long questions that she'd asked me. So I'd like to ask both Shamim and Sally a question. I was on a webinar last week organised by migrant rights organisations talking about changing the narrative on migration. The guest speaker said that in her experience, journalists are frazzled, usually under pressure from deadlines, and running to both write to their reports and be active on social media. She said she found that journalists were grateful and open to an issue or a story if they could be given fresh but succinct information. Shamim and Sally, you are both clearly very passionate about migrants' rights. but do you find the speaker's description reflects your experience of your colleagues or contemporaries in journalism? Frazzled, under pressure for deadlines, and running to both write their reports and active on social media.
Oh, this is a hard one. I suppose it really depends on the workload that each editor puts on the journalist, I suppose. And this is definitely an issue. People are under pressure. People are working, and I think it's not just people are active on social media. People, I think, are active on social media, journalists, because they need to be active on social media, not because to share their stories, but because I suppose to spot stories. You know, it's a good way to kind of both connect with sources and share your stories. So I've never kind of, every time I was on social media, it was for work reasons, you know. I don't think social media takes much of my time. I think the main issue around migration reporting for me is because there's a very, people who do it don't have migration backgrounds, you know, and because they don't have migration backgrounds, they share some of the views that the general public, the readers, their white readers share. And because of that, a lot of times it turns out that the articles turn out to be a little bit congratulatory, or pieces that glorify, one of my main issues is pieces that glorify successful immigrants. I don't think it's fair to anybody to kind of over glorify successful immigrants, because it kind of sends this message that in order to be embraced, you should be successful, you should be a barrister, you should be a doctor, you should be a nurse, you know. As you can be anybody, if you're been displaced for whatever reason, you can be anybody you want. My main problem with migration reporting is that, but what I don't see possibly, I suppose, people are guard kind of access to be what they really want to be because of the editorial decisions that are out there. Sometimes maybe the editor wants the report to be overly positive on migration, you know, or overly negative on migration. So it's, I don't want to say it's all journalists' fault, because their editors' fault as well. But the kind of the dominant congratulatory positive migration reporting that's out there is, I think, it's not helping anybody. And I think it's really time for the mainstream media in Ireland to kind of went ahead and said, we actually do need someone with a migration background, with a lived experience to tell these stories, you know?
Very good. Yeah, that's actually quite linked to a second question I have. I don't know, Sally, do you want to answer that one about being frazzled and all the time on Twitter?
Yeah, I mean, I'd say that I'm generally frazzled, to be quite honest. So I think that that's quite accurate. In terms of deadlines, I mean, the way that I work is a bit different, but I'm lucky that I've been able to do that. Like, I stayed freelance. I've been freelance since 2016, and that is largely because I wanted to be able to have the freedom to pursue stories that I think are important, and also because I didn't want to constantly have deadlines that mean that, you know, I have to rush things in terms of, you know, if you interview someone who's traumatized, for example, and then you're interviewing someone else who's been through something horrible, you would need to be able to take a bit of time to do those types of interviews, and also to report more in depth. But I mean, I can do that because, you know, I don't have children. I'm like, don't even live anywhere, you know, I like don't own any property. I don't own any furniture. I'm like, have very low outlay costs, you know, so I don't need to earn huge amounts of money. But that's obviously, you know, that would be rare enough, particularly as you get older. And yeah, I think that it's hard if you want to do this reporting well, particularly as a staff journalist, when there is and this isn't necessarily the fault of newspapers. I mean, the media industry has less money, so like they do require more of people than they used to. At least that's what I hear from people who have been journalists a long time. And yeah, of course, if you give succinct information, I mean, that's a slightly different question, because that's just like about imparting information, isn't it? Like, people can send you things that are very complicated and you're like, I have no idea what you're talking about. So, you know, succinct information is just a good way of communicating with anyone in general. Like that's pretty basic. But yeah, and in terms of social media, I mean, I would say that I have always worked through social media, but I mean, that's partially how I became a journalist. That's how I get contacts. That's how I stay in touch with sources. I'm in touch a lot of the time with people who want something shared immediately. And so I will share that information on Twitter, for example, so that there is awareness of it. And I've seen actually my Twitter, for example, that thread that I spoke about that got millions of views. I was using that to update at some stages, like I think for about a year almost daily, on what was happening in different detention centers. And it became kind of like a go-to for people who wanted, you know, because you can't write a newspaper article every day about the latest update on Libyan detention centers, you know. So people who want that information, they can go to that Twitter thread and see what are they saying is happening in this center, what is happening in this center. And actually I felt like that was very valuable to have that way of communicating this. And yeah, I don't think social media is just frivolous. I mean, it's useful for all sorts of things in relation to your work. For me, I travel a lot as well, so I'm not, you know, I use it to stay in touch with everybody. I don't always have the same phone number. I don't always have the same you know, I don't have an address or anything. So people, if they want to reach me, it's through email or social media. So yeah, I don't know if that fully answers, but you get the idea.
Yeah. I read the other day, somebody described getting your news from social media was a bit like drinking out of a fire hydrant. You have to do it very carefully with the flow of information. Okay, so a question, I think it's kind of related to what Shamim was talking about. So this is a chicken and egg question. I think there's no doubt that they were more receptive to Ukrainian refugees. Previously, I would have said that Syrians were further up our receptive ladder than Africans. To what extent is the media responsible for our collective lack of empathy towards, for instance, African people rather to others? And to what extent is media reflecting society, or is it both society and media? Tough question.
I think it has two parts, the questions. One part is about the Africans. And I think, yeah, I want to first answer that question. And I think it kind of well reflected in the way that the media covered the Ukraine. And I think it saw it as a big opportunity to kind of play the line of the Irish generosity, the Irish goodness, to welcome the refugees. And I remember when we first did the story about the Nigerian boy who was Nigerian citizen. He had family in Dublin and he was blocked from coming to join them. He was fleeing Ukraine. He was a medical student in Ukraine. He was blocked from coming to Dublin because he was a Nigerian passport. We were completely shocked that nobody reached out to us to say, oh, would you put us in touch? Fine. I think it was a couple of weeks ago that Morning Ireland RTE got in touch with us and they did a story on that. But nobody from the Broad Street got in touch with us to say we want to cover this. But they've done loads of stories. They've sent people to over the border to Poland to cover the Irish generosity to people coming in, you know.
Yeah.
I think it is disheartening to see that, or the fact that I don't think it was paid attention to or looked at. The fact that permanent Ukrainian residents, people who hold permanent residence permits in Ukraine, they are still need the visa to come here, you know, to seek, to get the temporary international protection that's available to them. That wasn't looked at all. And that was another thing we covered. And it was not covered by anybody else because it could have been covered, you know, if people had reached out to us, I would have put them in touch with the source that I had. So it's pretty shocking, you know, that I blame the overall approach of promoting the Irish generosity, the Irish goodness, and I'm really upset about the fact that these kind of positive stories sometimes bury stories that actually are important and need to be told. About the second part, which was is the media reflective of the society? And like, no, I don't think so. Like even in print journalism, I mean, I don't know. I'm sure there are, but I don't know people from similar backgrounds as I would be coming from, you know, who do this professionally and consistently. And one of the biggest blocks there is that, unfortunately, the issues around immigration permissions, you know, you're forced to do something that gets you permission to remain in the country, not what you love to pursue, you know. And immigrants are encouraged to do something in tech if they want to stay here, you know, because that's the easiest way to get an Irish residence permit card. So there's so many obstacles on the way, you know, for immigrants to get into media, to get into journalism. And the opportunity is not offered to them either, you know. I remember I've applied for internship programs when I was a student. I never got them, you know. So I think the media is not reflective of society at all.
Okay, there's major systemic issues that we have to deal with. Thank you, Sinead. Sally, you want to take that question or?
Yeah, for me, I mean, in terms of what you're saying about Africans, sorry, I might have forgotten part of the question, but hopefully I'll answer this correctly.
Sorry, yeah, more of a negative narrative towards African refugees than there was.
Well, you know what I would say in terms of Irish media, I mean, like you said, so I am freelance, but since November, I've been on contract with the Irish Times as the Africa correspondent. And from my knowledge, I'm the only contracted journalist working for an Irish media outlet in Africa, like across the whole of Africa, which means that the awareness that people are getting of African issues is generally from what I can see is coming through aid agencies, because Ireland has a lot of aid agencies, you know, like massive ones like Concern, Goal and Trócaire and all of the others, and they are like releasing information that is aimed at raising donations. So they're releasing a very specific type of information, which is not necessarily to criticize, because I haven't done a proper, like, I'm not aware of all what is being released, but I mean, like I said earlier, from what I saw that ad on the other day, there isn't context in that. And so we basically have had a situation where the Irish public aren't getting, you know, nuanced or journalistic information about Africa, apart from, I guess, what's being run through wire reports and what's being compiled from a desk in Dublin. And like Shamim was saying, that's obviously very wide. I mean, I'm also white, you know, which is, you know, it's not ideal if I'm like literally the only one who's covering the whole continent of like more than 1 billion people. And I think in terms of Ukrainians, I mean, I haven't, again, I don't live in Ireland, so I haven't been following properly, you know, all the media coverage of it. But from what I can see, there is like a lot more sympathy, and are a lot of these feel good narratives. And I've been seeing this as somebody who's been covering the treatment of African refugees who are trying to reach Europe, and literally the atrocities that are being inflicted on them for attempting to reach safety as a result of European policy for years and years and years, and trying to get people to pay attention to that. And now seeing that there is this very different reaction towards Ukrainians. And like Shamim said, it's like a feel-good factor. And now people will use that as an argument. Well, we don't need to care about the other situations on Europe's other borders because, you know, we're doing so much for Ukrainians. But the fact is that they didn't care before anyway. So that was never, you know, that was never an excuse before, but now it is being used as an excuse. And I think that we have these arguments like that. Sorry, you know, we've seen the racist media coverage, you know, people saying Ukrainians are civilized, they're educated, there are IT professionals. I mean, I've interviewed many African, and I'm saying African here because I've reported on like people from a lot of countries, but there are many African countries, as we all know. And, you know, of course, I've interviewed IT professionals, educated people, you know, civilized is obviously kind of a charged word. But I think that coverage was clearly racist, like that's what it was. So we also need to call that out. And in terms of, sorry, the last part of your question, I've now forgot. That was it.
Does the media kind of reflect the general society?
I think again that I mean, again, the media is being, you're saying the media, but what the media also covers is politicians. And we've seen politicians that use migrants and refugees as political footballs, like I said before. And what we need to remember is that I think it's 87% of refugees are in developing countries at the moment. And, you know, I lived in Uganda for 2 years. I've lived in Uganda. They have a huge number of refugees, but they don't use it as a, you know, it's not used in governments like this as a way of, it's not politicized in the same way. I mean, yeah, I think what it would be comparable to in Uganda is the way they actually use homosexuality, that they will start blaming things on, you know, gay people, for example. If something's going wrong, they want to distract, you know, if they're under pressure in government and they want to distract from that, they'll start saying things about homosexuality, which is also terrible and is also a vulnerable portion of the population that you can blame things on. And in Europe, what we see is migrants being blamed or refugees being blamed. And it's you know, I've lived in Europe, and I lived in the UK when Brexit happened. I was actually at the UK party on the night of Brexit reporting on that, and I would compare the two. The way that the UK politicians were using migrants is the way that the Ugandan government use, you know, gay people to basically deflect and distract and kind of score political points. And yeah,
and often the very migrants that are coming over, the Ukrainians, because it was during the Brexit campaign, a lot of it was about this migrant flow coming from Eastern Europe. You know,
I think at the time they were, I mean, what they say and what they, you know, what they're, I think that they were actually complaining a lot about Syrians at the time. I mean, they were saying one thing, but they were showing images of another thing. And so it was more like a general kind of demonization of people who were, sorry, I'm not, of people who were, you know, again, it was kind of racism, because I was in the UK at the time as an economic migrant. You know, I was there for a job, and I'd say to people, but I'm from a different country and I've come to get a job. And they're like, no, but you're different. You know, you're not the same as these other people from these other countries. And actually, I mean, it's a much broader issue. We don't have time to go into everything, but refugees are people who have an international right to protection, you know? So the fact that we're even equating all these, you know, all of that we've made it that people seeking safety can be locked up for trying to seek safety instead of that they should be given empathy, that's a political issue. And of course, the media then provides a feedback or a feedback loop, because they'll repeat what the politicians say, because you have to do that, because what a politician says is newsworthy. But then that's kind of repeating something that may not be a proper representation of the truth. And so kind of this loop continues. So sorry, that was a kind of long answer, but I explained it a little bit.
I'm looking at the time here. It's already 20 minutes past 8. There's one question which is kind of like a technical question. Then I've got kind of a last, I think maybe wrap up question. Just curious as to what one is meant to do when one sees something incorrectly reported that is definitely incorrect, but you would be in serious trouble if you went on record. What would your advice be to that person?
The person sees something that's factually incorrect in the media, and what they should do, is it?
Yeah, but it seems to be something where you would be in serious trouble if you went on record.
If you called it out on social media.
Yeah, maybe, yeah.
I suppose then, I guess if you could go to the press council with it, you know, you could put a complaint.
So the press, just explain the press council.
So the press council is if something is incorrect or unfairly reported, and the members of the public, and if I suppose the newspaper also refuses to acknowledge or engage with it in any way, you know, you go to the press council, which is I suppose polices the media in Ireland, and they would look into it, and if they find that the story was incorrect or factually not factually inaccurate, they would issue a statement and make this clear. And I suppose that story needs to be taken down. And I suppose that would be a huge blow to the reputation of the reporter who covered it, you know. And I know there's been loads of controversy around the press council in recent times, and but it's still something that's worth doing. If you see something that's being unfair or incites hatred against a certain group. I know recently there was a headline and they used a very racist quote from an unnamed border control officer in it. And I think that these things are stuff that they're worth reporting, you know. If the paper chooses to take it down, definitely go to the press council.
Press council, very good. Got loads of questions here.
Sorry, could I?
Yeah, sorry. Yeah.
Could I just add, if what they're asking is also if they see that somebody has said something that's then been reported, but that is inaccurate, what you could also do, if the problem isn't the journalist's fault, but what is being reported, if that makes sense, you could also approach the journalist and say, I have this information, can I stay anonymous? Or, you can ask them first, can you be anonymous? And then you give them the information. But I deal with anonymous sources all the time. That's how I get a lot of information, which I can then triangulate. And you can have a conversation with that journalist where your identity isn't, exposed, or you divulge as much as you want to say, or, you discuss your relationship. You can approach people. We don't publish everything that you send to us. You can have that discussion. So if the journalist isn't at fault, I think approaching the journalist and saying, you reported that this person said this, for example, but actually that's not the reality on the ground, and I have evidence, but I need to be protected. This is how I could be protected. And it's a conversation.
Excellent. Okay, I'm going to get skewered here, but I just get one question, I think, which is quite interesting. How do you draw the line between journalism and advocacy, given the difficult issues and circumstances on which you're reporting? So this has to be a forward response.
Well, for me, it's like, if you look at my articles, I think it's very clear that I stick to the facts, and whatever experiences or biases I have, I leave it out the door. So I don't think biases is the issue, but I suppose a lot of people tell me that by choosing the stories you choose to cover, it is still a little bit of advocacy in it. But in terms of reporting, I don't editorialize, and I don't editorialize, and I like to do a straightforward reporting.
Okay, excellent. Yeah, Sally?
Yeah, for me as well. I'd say that there's a difference between a journalist and an activist. Like, I don't think that, like, we're not proposing solutions, we're reporting the facts as we find them. And you've asked us some questions today which I would suggest are more related to advocacy rather than journalism, because I don't think about the impact necessarily of my stories. I don't think that my role is to consider, of course you think about what the consequences might be for sources, but I don't think that my role is to try and create this change or try and create that change. Having said that, I think you can still be objective and highlight that there is a problem in a system, or highlight that there is a human rights abuse happening or an atrocity happening. But yeah, I guess you need to, you're not, that's your focus basically.
You're one step removed. Okay, this is my question. Yeah, it's probably going to be my last question. It's 2025. It's supposed to wrap up at about 15:15. So how can we best promote a positive media narrative around these issues? What do you think should be done? Suppose you were made the editor of the Irish Times or director of RTE. What would you do?
Yeah, if I was in charge of those organizations, I think RTE is doing better, so I'm going to focus on the Irish Times. I would definitely hire migrants from various backgrounds, refugee, immigrants, and on top of that, from all sorts of backgrounds, if they're LGBT, any minority groups in their newsroom. I think their current newsroom is lacking in that, and they need to do something.
Excellent. Yeah. Conclusion. Yeah.
Yeah, in terms, again, I think your question is slightly straying into calling us advocates, but yeah, I agree with Shamim. There needs to be a lot more diversity in terms of who is writing the news, who is reporting the news. Also, Yeah, I honestly, I think that there is a power in just presenting the information. And I think that we just need to do that to the best of our ability. And I will say again that this information is hard won, and it really makes a difference when people engage with it, when they read it, when they share it, you know, when they tell people about it. It might seem like a small thing, but that, you know, we're trying to fulfill our role, and we're going to a lot of lengths to try and do that. And yeah, anyone who engages with that, it's very helpful.
Okay, I think we should leave it there. Thank you very much, Sally and Shamim. Really interesting. I could ask you questions and go on for another 2 or 3 hours, and I'm sure you wouldn't be too pleased with that, maybe over a couple of pints or something. But yeah, I found it really informative and of great value, like in terms of, I applaud you both for the work that you do, and, you know, shining a spotlight on these issues and bringing the facts for us. You know, it's central, a central process that's for any sort of functioning democracy. And yeah, as I said, I applaud you. Thank you very much. I'm going to hand over to Aga to come in now.
Yeah, so you can see my clapping hands. It was amazing discussion, and thank you really so much for sharing your views and being very honest as well, and critical about also our sector, which I think has a really strong role to play. And I think, you know, the media and the NGOs should work together to change the narratives about migrations and migration and migrants and refugees, asylum seekers. And so once again, thank you all who participated as well, who asked questions, and who sent the resources as well. And also we would like to invite you for the 1st June, the 3rd session of the series on criminalization of humanitarians. So I hope to see you all in a month's time. Bye.
Thank you very much.